The sun beat down on dusty plains, baking the earth a crispy brown. Caleb squinted, wiping sweat from his brow with a calloused hand. His ranch, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden. Since his mother passed, everything seemed heavier, the chores longer, the silence louder. She'd been the heart of the place, her laughter echoing through the valley. Now, only the wind whispered secrets through the tall grass. Martha, his mother, had been a woman of unwavering faith. Even in her final days, weakened by illness, she'd clutched her worn Bible, her lips moving in silent prayer. Caleb remembered kneeling beside her bed, her frail hand squeezing his. "Find a good woman, Caleb," she'd rasped, her voice thin but earnest. "Someone with kindness in her heart and fire in her spirit. Someone who will bring light back into this house." He hadn't taken her words seriously then, focused on the pain of losing her. Women were scarce in these parts, and his life was consumed by the ranch. Love felt like a distant dream, a luxury he couldn't afford. But now, weeks after her funeral, her wish echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his loneliness. He missed her prayers, her warm smile, and the comforting feeling that everything would be all right. The ranch needed him. The cattle were restless, the fences needed mending, and the hay had to be brought in before the next storm. Caleb pushed his grief aside, focusing on the task at hand. He climbed onto his trusty horse, Dusty, and headed towards the hayfield. The image of his mother's hopeful face burned into his memory. Maybe, just maybe, there was a woman out there for him. Maybe his mother's prayers would be answered after all. He just couldn't imagine where she would come from, or how he would ever find her amidst the endless expanse of the West. He sighed, kicking Dusty into a gentle trot. His mother's last prayer felt like a heavy weight on his shoulders, an impossible task in a world that felt increasingly empty. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as Caleb finished his work in the hayfield. He stacked the last bale onto the wagon, his muscles aching. He decided to leave the load in the barn overnight rather than risk a late trip back to the ranch house. Dust coated his clothes and skin, making him itch. He patted Dusty's neck, offering him a few soothing words. "All right, boy, let's get you some water." As they approached the barn, a strange feeling washed over Caleb. An unsettling quiet hung in the air, different from the usual peaceful stillness of the evening. Dusty snorted nervously, his ears twitching. Caleb frowned, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle he always carried. Something wasn't right. He led Dusty into the shadowy interior of the barn, the scent of hay and earth filling his nostrils. He unhitched the wagon and gave Dusty a slap. "Go on, get yourself some water." The horse ambled towards a trough. Caleb slowly made his way toward the ladder leading to the hayloft, his rifle held ready. He strained his ears, listening for any sound. Silence. He climbed the ladder, each step creaking under his weight, the silence amplifying every noise. Reaching the top, he peered into the dim loft, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. And then he saw her. Curled up in a nest of hay, a young woman lay sleeping. Her face was pale, smudged with dirt. Her clothes were torn and dusty, her brown hair tangled around her face. She looked exhausted, utterly vulnerable. Caleb lowered his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was she? And what was she doing in his hayloft? He had never seen her before in these parts. Was she running away from something? Or someone? He cautiously approached, careful not to wake her, his mind racing with questions and a growing sense of unease. He noticed a small, worn satchel clutched tightly in her hand. As he got closer, he saw a silver locket dangling from her neck, catching the faint light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. It was heart-shaped. His mind raced as to why a woman would be sleeping in his hayloft. He hesitated, unsure what to do. He could leave her there, let her sleep, but the thought felt wrong. What if she was hurt? Or worse, what if someone was looking for her? He gently shook her shoulder. "Mung? Ma'am, wake up." The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She gasped, her body tensing as she scrambled backwards, knocking against the hay bales. Fear widened her eyes as she stared up at him, her gaze darting around the loft as if searching for an escape. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" Caleb raised his hands, tried to appear non-threatening. "Easy, ma'am. I am Caleb. This is my ranch. I just found you sleeping in my hayloft. Are you all right?" She didn't answer, her eyes still filled with suspicion. She clutched the satchel tighter, her knuckles white. I didn't mean to trespass," she stammered. "I was just tired." "I can see that," Caleb said, his voice softening. "But you can't just go sleeping in people's barns. It's not safe. What's your name?" She hesitated again, her gaze flickering away. "Sarah," she finally mumbled. "All right, Sarah. Can you tell me what you're doing here? Where are you headed?" Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to ward off the questions. I can't," she said, her voice barely audible. "Please, just let me go. I won't cause any trouble." Caleb frowned. Her evasiveness only deepened his suspicion. "I can't do that, Sarah. You're clearly running from something. Are you in trouble? Is someone after you?" He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "If you tell me what's going on, maybe I can help." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No one can help me," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "It's too late." She looked so small and lost, huddled in the hay. Caleb felt a pang of sympathy, but he knew he couldn't let her go without knowing the truth. He needed to understand what she was running from before he could decide what to do. "Sarah, please. Trust me. I won't hurt you. Just tell me your story." He waited patiently, giving her time to decide, the silence broken only by the rustling of the hay and the distant lowing of cattle. He wondered if this mysterious woman could be the answer to his mother's prayer. Caleb's mind drifted back to the final weeks of his mother's life. The memory was vivid, sharp with the ache of loss. He recalled the scent of lavender and the faint sound of her labored breathing. He remembered her eyes, once so bright and full of life, now clouded with pain but still filled with love. She had spent her days praying, her rosary beads clicking softly in her trembling hands. Sometimes Caleb would sit beside her, listening to her whispers, even though he couldn't always make out the words. He knew she was praying for him, for his happiness. One afternoon, she had called him closer, her voice weak but insistent. "Caleb," she'd said, her hand reaching for his. "I won't be here much longer." He'd squeezed her hand, tears stinging his eyes. "Don't talk like that, Mama." But she continued, her gaze fixed on his. "I have one last prayer, Caleb. One last wish for you." He'd leaned in closer, his heart aching. "Anything, Mama. Anything for you." "Find a woman, Caleb," she'd whispered. "A good woman. A woman with a kind heart and a strong spirit. A woman who needs you and who you need in return. Someone who will love you for who you are, not for what you have." She described the kind of woman she envisioned for him. Someone with eyes that sparkled with intelligence, a smile that could light up a room, and a heart filled with compassion. She spoke of a woman who was brave and resilient, who could face hardship with grace and determination. She even mentioned brown hair and a fondness for animals, details that seemed almost whimsical at the time. "Pray, Caleb," she'd said, her voice fading. "Pray that God will guide you to her. She's out there, somewhere. And when you find her, you'll know. You'll feel it in your heart." He'd promised her he would, though he doubted he ever could. Now, looking at Sarah huddled in the hay, her eyes filled with fear and desperation, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the answer to his mother's prayer, however unlikely it seemed. The woman in his hayloft, scared and secretive, certainly didn't match the picture his mother had painted. But there was something about her vulnerability, something in her eyes, that stirred a flicker of recognition deep within him. He pushed the thought aside, reminding himself that he barely knew her and that his mother's dying wish couldn't possibly be fulfilled in such a strange and unexpected way. Still, the memory lingered, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. The sky outside the barn windows deepened to a bruised purple, the last rays of sunlight fading. Caleb sighed, the weight of his mother's memory pressing down on him. He looked at Sarah, still huddled in the hay, her face pale and drawn. He couldn't just leave her there, not knowing what she was running from. "Look, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you're scared, but it's getting late. It's not safe out there alone. Why don't you come up to the house? I can offer you some food and a place to wash up. Then, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting between Caleb and the barn door. She seemed to weigh her options, suspicion warring with exhaustion. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right," she whispered, "but just for tonight." Caleb offered her a hand, and she reluctantly took it, her fingers surprisingly strong. He helped her to her feet, noticing how thin she was. He led her out of the barn and towards the ranch house, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Inside the house, he lit a kerosene lamp, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. He gestured toward the wash basin. "There's water and soap there. I'll get you something to eat." As Sarah washed her face and hands, Caleb busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and bread. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way she carefully conserved the water, the way she smoothed down her tattered clothes. Despite her fear and exhaustion, there was a quiet dignity about her, a resilience that reminded him of his mother. He placed the food on the table, and Sarah ate hungrily, but with a surprising amount of grace. She thanked him politely, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment before darting away again. After she finished eating, Caleb cleared the table. "So," he said, leaning against the counter, "are you going to tell me your story now?" Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping. She looked around the small, tidy kitchen, her gaze lingering on a framed photograph of Caleb and his mother. "It's a long story," she said, her voice low, "and it's not a pretty one." "I have time," Caleb replied, his eyes fixed on hers. He felt a growing protectiveness towards this woman, a desire to help her, to ease her pain. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he couldn't just turn her away. He had a feeling that Sarah needed his help, and perhaps, he realized with a jolt, he needed hers too. He remembered his mother's prayer and couldn't shake the feeling that fate had brought Sarah to his hayloft. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sun streaming through the windows of the ranch house. Caleb woke early, his mind still occupied with Sarah. He found her asleep in the spare room, curled up under a patchwork quilt that had belonged to his mother. He quietly closed the door, letting her rest. He went outside to tend to the chores, the familiar routine helping to ground him. He fed the chickens, milked the cows, and mended a section of fence that had been damaged by a recent storm. But his thoughts kept returning to Sarah, to her fear and her secrets. As he was finishing up, he saw a group of riders approaching the ranch. They were a rough-looking bunch, their faces weathered and hardened, their eyes cold and calculating. They rode in a tight formation, their horses kicking up dust. Caleb felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. The leader of the group, a tall, imposing man with a scar that ran down his left cheek, reined in his horse in front of the ranch house. He dismounted and strode towards Caleb, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You Caleb?" he asked, his voice gravelly and menacing. Caleb nodded, his hand instinctively moving towards the rifle he kept leaning against the fence. "That's right. What can I do for you?" "We're looking for someone," the man said, his eyes scanning the ranch house. "A young woman, brown hair about so high." He gestured vaguely with his hand. "Name's Sarah." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He knew then that Sarah's past had caught up with her. He tried to keep his face neutral, his voice calm. "Never heard of her. I haven't seen anyone like that around here." The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. "Don't lie to me. Rancher, we know she's here. We tracked her to this place." "You're mistaken," Caleb insisted, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I live here alone." The man smirked, a cruel, unsettling expression. "All right, have it your way. But we're not leaving until we find her. We'll be keeping an eye on this place." He turned to his men. "Spread out. Search the property." Caleb watched as the riders fanned out, their eyes searching every corner of the ranch. He knew he had to protect Sarah, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He had to think fast. He knew this Jed and his gang were trouble, and he wasn't about to let them get their hands on Sarah. His mother's prayer suddenly felt like a call to action. He had to protect this woman, no matter the cost. Caleb watched, as Jed's men ransacked his property, kicking over barrels, peering into sheds, and generally making a nuisance of themselves. He knew he couldn't let this go on for long. He had to get Sarah out of there, and fast. He casually walked towards the house, his eyes scanning the surroundings, trying to formulate a plan. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, her face white with fear. She had clearly heard the commotion outside. "They're here, aren't they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "They found me." Caleb nodded grimly. "That's right. But don't worry, I won't let them get to you." "Who are they?" he asked, even though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "That's Jedediah Blackwood," she said, her voice barely audible. He wants to marry me." "Marry you?" Caleb frowned. "But you don't want to marry him." Sarah shook her head vehemently. "Never. He's a cruel man, Caleb. He only wants me for my family's land. My father promised me to him before he died. But I won't go. I'd rather die than be his wife." "So you ran away?" Caleb asked, piecing together the story. Sarah nodded. "I had to. I couldn't bear the thought of spending my life with him. I want to choose my own destiny. I want to be free." Caleb looked at her, his heart filled with admiration for her courage. He understood her desire for freedom, her refusal to be controlled. He knew he had to help her, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because he felt a connection to her, a sense that their fates were intertwined. "All right, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "I'll help you. We'll get you away from here. But we have to be smart about it. Jed won't give up easily." He quickly outlined a plan, his mind racing with possibilities. They would have to use the terrain to their advantage, to outsmart Jed and his gang. He knew the back trails and hidden canyons like the back of his hand. He could use that knowledge to help Sarah escape. He told her to grab any supplies she had and meet him at the back of the barn in 5 minutes. He knew this was risky, but he couldn't let Jed take Sarah. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a determination to keep her safe. He realized that his mother's prayer wasn't just about finding love. It was about standing up for what was right. Caleb hurried out of the house, his rifle in hand. He spotted Jed talking to one of his men near the barn. He had to distract them by Sarah some time. "Jedediah Blackwood," he called out, his voice ringing across the yard. "I think we need to have a little talk." Jed turned, his scarred face breaking into a cruel smile. Well, he said, sauntering towards Caleb. "Looks like our stubborn rancher has decided to cooperate." "I haven't decided anything," Caleb said, his eyes fixed on Jed. "But I won't have you tearing up my property. You want something, you come to me directly." "I want Sarah," Jed said, his voice low and menacing. "And I'm going to get her, one way or another." "She's not here," Caleb insisted, his hand tightening on his rifle. "Don't play coy with me, Caleb," Jed sneered. "I know she's hiding somewhere, and when I find her, you're going to regret interfering." Caleb stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. He knew he was taking a huge risk, but he couldn't back down now. He had to protect Sarah, even if it meant facing Jed's wrath. As they argued, Sarah quietly slipped out of the back of the house and made her way towards the barn, following Caleb's instructions. She clutched her small satchel tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was her only chance to escape. Inside the barn, she found Dusty saddled and ready to go. Caleb had thought of everything. She quickly mounted the horse, her hands trembling. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She had to be brave. She had to be strong. Just as she was about to ride out of the barn, she heard voices approaching. Jed and his men were heading towards the barn, their search intensifying. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears. She was trapped. But then she heard a gunshot. Caleb had fired a warning shot, drawing Jed and his men away from the barn. It was her chance. She kicked Dusty into a gallop, bursting out of the barn and heading towards the back trails, her escape covered by Caleb's courageous distraction. She glanced back and saw Caleb facing down Jed and his men, a lone figure standing against overwhelming odds. A wave of gratitude washed over her, mixed with fear for his safety. She knew she had to get away, but she also knew she couldn't forget the man who had risked everything to help her. She wondered if Caleb was the answer to her prayers, just as she might be the answer to his mother's. She urged Dusty onward, determined to make her escape and hoping that Caleb would be all right. "You think you're so clever, Caleb," Jed sneered, his eyes blazing with anger. "But you can't protect her forever. I'll find her, and when I do, you'll pay the price for your interference." "She's free to choose her own life, Jed," Caleb retorted, his voice firm. "You can't force her to marry you." "She's promised to me," Jed roared, his face turning red with rage. "Her father gave me his word. She belongs to me." "She belongs to no one but herself," Caleb said, his hand tightening on his rifle. He knew he was outnumbered, but he refused to back down. He had to stand up to Jed, not just for Sarah, but for his own sense of honor. Jed lunged at Caleb, his fist flying. Caleb dodged the blow and retaliated, landing a solid punch on Jed's jaw. The two men grappled, their bodies colliding in a flurry of fists and elbows. Jed's men surged forward, trying to overwhelm Caleb. But Caleb was quick and agile, using his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. He dodged and weaved, landing blows where he could, trying to keep Jed's men at bay. The fight raged on, the air filled with dust and the sounds of grunts and curses. Caleb knew he couldn't hold out forever. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he refused to surrender. He had to buy Sarah as much time as possible. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his side. One of Jed's men had managed to sneak up behind him and stab him with a knife. Caleb gasped, stumbling backwards, his hand clutching his bleeding side. Jed smirked, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Looks like your little game is over, Caleb," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Now, where's Sarah?" Caleb coughed, his vision blurring. He knew he was in serious trouble. He had to find a way to protect Sarah, even if it meant sacrificing himself. As Jed approached, Caleb saw a glint of metal in the distance. He recognized the silver locket that Sarah wore around her neck, glinting in the sunlight as she rode away. He knew then that she was safe. He had done his job. He had protected her. He closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had stood up for what was right, and he had helped a woman in need. He knew his mother would have been proud of him. He whispered a silent prayer, hoping that Sarah would find happiness and freedom. He felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that he had made a difference, however small. And as darkness closed in, he knew that he had found something he had been searching for all along. A purpose, a reason to believe, and perhaps, just perhaps, a love that transcended all boundaries. Even if he didn't survive, he now believed Sarah was the answer to his mother's prayer. The world swam back into focus, a haze of pain and confusion. Caleb blinked, his hand still pressed against his bleeding side. He was lying on the ground, the sky spinning above him. He could hear Jed's voice, distorted and distant. "He's still alive," Jed barked. "Finish him off, and then find Sarah." Caleb knew he was helpless. He was too weak to fight, too injured to run. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But then he heard another gunshot, and then another. He opened his eyes, his vision clearing slightly. He saw a group of riders approaching, their faces grim and determined. They were the townspeople, led by the grizzled old sheriff, Hank. "Get off his property, Jedediah," Hank roared, his voice booming across the yard. "You and your gang are no longer welcome in this town." Jed cursed, his face contorted with anger. He knew he was outnumbered. He couldn't take on the townspeople and the sheriff. He glared at Caleb, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over, Caleb," he snarled. "I'll be back, and when I am, you'll regret the day you ever crossed me." He turned to his men. "Let's go." Jed and his gang mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the distance. The townspeople dismounted and rushed to Caleb's side, their faces filled with concern. "Caleb, are you all right?" Hank asked, kneeling beside him. "I'll be all right," Caleb rasped, his voice weak. "Just a scratch." Hank frowned, examining Caleb's wound. "That's more than a scratch, son. We need to get you to the doctor." The townspeople carefully lifted Caleb and carried him into the house, laying him on his bed. Hank sent someone to fetch the doctor, while the others tended to his wound. As they worked, Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness. He heard snippets of conversations, saw faces blurring in and out of focus. He felt a sense of gratitude towards the townspeople, their loyalty and their willingness to help him. He realized that he wasn't alone. He had friends, people who cared about him. When the doctor finally arrived, he examined Caleb's wound and shook his head grimly. "It's a deep one," he said. "He's lucky to be alive. He'll need to rest and recover, and he'll need someone to take care of him." Caleb heard those words, and his heart skipped a beat. He wondered if Sarah was safe, if she had managed to escape. He hoped that she was all right, that she was free to live her life on her own terms. He knew that he had done everything he could to help her, and he was proud of that. And as he drifted back into unconsciousness, he couldn't help but wonder if she would ever return. He knew his mother would have wanted him to protect her, and he had. It was a testament to his mother's prayers. Days turned into weeks, and Caleb slowly began to recover. He was confined to his bed, his wound healing but still painful. The townspeople took turns caring for him, bringing him food, changing his bandages, and keeping him company. He was grateful for their kindness and support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He longed for Sarah, wondering where she was and if she was safe. One afternoon, as he was lying in bed, he heard a soft knock on the door. He looked up and saw Sheriff Hank standing there, his face grave. "Caleb," Hank said, his voice low, "we found something you need to see." He stepped aside, and Caleb saw two of the townspeople carrying a battered and blood-stained satchel. He recognized it instantly. It was Sarah's satchel. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "We found it near the creek, a few miles from here," Hank said, his eyes filled with concern. There was blood on it, Caleb. A lot of blood." Caleb felt a wave of despair wash over him. He couldn't believe it. Had Jed found Sarah after all? Had he killed her? The thought was unbearable. "We don't know for sure what happened," Hank said, trying to reassure him. "But we're worried, Caleb. We haven't seen any sign of Sarah. We think Jed might have caught up with her." Caleb closed his eyes, his heart aching. He had failed to protect her. He had let Jed get away with it. He felt a surge of anger and frustration. He couldn't just lie there and do nothing. He had to find Sarah, even if it meant facing Jed again. He sat up in bed, his body protesting with pain. "I'm going after her," he said, his voice firm. "Caleb, you can't," Hank exclaimed. "You're not strong enough. You're still recovering." "I don't care," Caleb said, his eyes filled with determination. "I have to find her. I owe it to her, and I owe it to my mother." He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, his body swaying. He knew he was weak, but he refused to give up. He had to find Sarah, even if it was the last thing he did. He knew she would have done the same for him. His mother's prayer had to mean something. He couldn't let Jed win. He was going to find Sarah, and he was going to bring her home. He was ready to face Jed again, no matter the cost. Despite Hank's protests, Caleb, fueled by adrenaline and determination, managed to saddle Dusty and ride out of town. He followed the trail, leading away from the creek, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of Sarah. His side throbbed with pain, but he ignored it, his focus solely on finding her. After riding for several hours, he spotted something in the distance, a plume of smoke rising from a small canyon. He urged Dusty forward, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he heard voices. He dismounted, tying Dusty to a nearby tree, and cautiously approached the canyon, his rifle raised. Peeking over the edge, he saw Jed and his men gathered around a campfire. They were laughing and drinking, their faces flushed with victory. And then he saw her. Sarah was tied to a tree, her face bruised and battered. She looked weak and exhausted, but her eyes still burned with defiance. Caleb felt a surge of anger and determination. He had to rescue her, no matter the cost. He knew he couldn't take on Jed and his men alone. He needed a plan. He scanned the canyon, looking for any advantage. He noticed a narrow path leading up the side of the canyon wall, hidden by a thicket of bushes. An idea formed in his mind. He quietly made his way to the path and began to climb, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached the top of the canyon wall, overlooking Jed's camp. He could see everything. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. It was time to act. He fired a shot into the air, drawing Jed's attention. "Jedediah Blackwood," he called out, his voice ringing across the canyon. "This ends now." Jed and his men looked up, their faces filled with surprise and anger. They scrambled for their weapons, but Caleb was ready for them. He opened fire, his shots hitting their mark. A chaotic gunfight erupted, the canyon echoing with the sounds of gunfire and shouting. Caleb fired quickly and accurately, picking off Jed's men one by one. But he knew he couldn't hold out forever. He was outnumbered, and he was running out of ammunition. Suddenly, he heard a commotion behind him. He turned and saw Sarah, free from her bonds, charging towards Jed with a rock in her hand. She swung the rock with all her might, hitting Jed in the back of the head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Sarah ran to Caleb's side, her eyes filled with concern. "Caleb, are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm all right," Caleb said, smiling weakly, "but we need to get out of here. Now." Together, they fought their way down the canyon wall, dodging bullets and outsmarting Jed's remaining men. They reached Dusty and mounted the horse, riding away as fast as they could, leaving Jed and his gang behind them. They had worked together, using their wits and courage to overcome overwhelming odds. And as they rode away, Caleb knew that he and Sarah were meant to be together. His mother's prayer had come true in the most unexpected way. They rode for hours, the sun beating down on their backs, the landscape blurring into a haze of dust and heat. Caleb's side throbbed with pain, and he could feel himself growing weaker. Sarah noticed his discomfort and reined in Dusty, her face etched with concern. "Caleb, you're hurt," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to stop. You need rest." "I'm fine," Caleb insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew he was pushing himself too hard, but he couldn't afford to stop. Jed could be after them. "No, you're not," Sarah said firmly. "You're losing blood. We need to find a safe place to rest and tend to your wound." She led Dusty toward a small grove of trees, hidden from view by a rocky outcrop. They dismounted, and Sarah helped Caleb to lie down in the shade, his face pale and drawn. She examined his wound, her touch gentle and caring. "It's bad," she said, her eyes filled with worry. "We need to clean it and bandage it." She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and used it to clean the wound, her movements precise and efficient. Caleb winced in pain, but he didn't complain. He watched her, his heart filled with gratitude for her kindness and courage. As she tended to his wound, Sarah told him about her life, about her family, and about her dreams for the future. She spoke of her love for the land, her desire for freedom, and her determination to make her own way in the world. Caleb listened intently, his heart filled with admiration for her spirit. He realized that she was everything he had ever wanted in a woman: kind, courageous, and independent. He knew then that he was in love with her. After she finished bandaging his wound, Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her eyes meeting his. "For everything. For saving my life." "You don't have to thank me," Caleb said, his voice soft. "I would do anything for you, Sarah. Anything at all." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. He felt a surge of warmth and connection, a sense that they were meant to be together. He looked into her eyes, his heart filled with love. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling, I think I'm falling in love with you." Sarah smiled, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. They leaned in closer, their lips meeting in a gentle kiss. It was a kiss filled with tenderness and passion, a kiss that sealed their fate. They knew then that they were destined to be together, that their love was stronger than any obstacle, any danger. Even the pain in his side seemed to fade as he kissed her. He knew then that his mother's prayer had been answered, and that Sarah was the woman he was meant to spend his life with. He would do anything to protect her. They stayed in the grove for 2 days, resting and recovering. Sarah took care of Caleb, tending to his wound, cooking simple meals, and keeping watch for any sign of danger. Caleb, in turn, shared his stories with her, telling her about his life on the ranch, about his mother, and about his dreams for the future. Their love grew stronger with each passing day, forged in the crucible of hardship and danger. They knew that they had found something special, something that they couldn't afford to lose. On the third day, Caleb felt strong enough to travel. They saddled Dusty and set off again, heading towards the town. They knew that Jed might still be out there, but they were no longer afraid. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. As they approached the town, they saw a group of riders coming towards them. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He recognized Sheriff Hank and the townspeople. They were riding to meet them, their faces filled with relief. "Caleb, Sarah," Hank called out, his voice booming across the plains. "We were worried sick about you." The townspeople surrounded them, their faces filled with joy. They had heard about what had happened at the canyon, and they were proud of Caleb and Sarah's courage. "We took care of Jed and his gang," Hank said, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "We tracked them down and ran them out of the county. They won't be bothering you again." Caleb and Sarah smiled, relief washing over them. They were finally safe. They were finally free. The townspeople escorted them back to the town, where they were greeted as heroes. They were given a warm welcome, and they were showered with gifts and congratulations. As they stood in the middle of the town square, surrounded by their friends and neighbors, Caleb took Sarah's hand in his. He looked into her eyes, his heart filled with love. "Sarah," he said, his voice ringing with emotion, "will you marry me?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Yes, Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I will marry you." The townspeople cheered, their voices echoing through the valley. Caleb and Sarah embraced, their love shining brightly in the afternoon sun. They knew that they had found their happy ending, that their lives were finally complete. They were grateful for the challenges they had faced, for they had brought them together and forged a bond that could never be broken. They knew that their love was a testament to the power of fate, the power of courage, and the power of prayer. He knew his mother was looking down, smiling at their happiness. Her last prayer had been answered. He had found the woman of his dreams, the woman he was meant to spend his life with. He had found Sarah. The wedding took place a few weeks later, on a sunny afternoon in the town square. The entire town turned out to celebrate, their faces beaming with happiness. Caleb stood at the altar, his heart filled with joy. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze lingering on the faces of his friends and neighbors. He knew that he was lucky to have such a supportive community. He saw Sheriff Hank standing near the front, his eyes twinkling with pride. He had always been a good friend to Caleb, offering him advice and support whenever he needed it. Caleb knew that he could always count on Hank. He saw Mrs. Peterson, the town baker, standing next to Hank. She had baked the wedding cake, a magnificent creation covered in white frosting and delicate flowers. Caleb knew that it would be delicious. He saw Mr. Johnson, the town blacksmith, standing near the back. He had made the wedding rings, two simple bands of silver that symbolized Caleb and Sarah's love. Caleb knew that they would last a lifetime. And then he saw her. Sarah walked down the aisle, her face radiant with happiness. She wore a simple white dress, her brown hair flowing freely down her back. She looked like an angel, and Caleb knew that he was the luckiest man in the world. As she approached the altar, Caleb reached out and took her hand. Their fingers intertwined, their hearts beating as one. They looked into each other's eyes, their love shining brightly in the afternoon sun. The preacher began to speak, his voice filled with solemnity. He spoke of love, of commitment, and of the importance of family. Caleb and Sarah listened intently, their hearts filled with gratitude. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the marriage, a hush fell over the crowd. Caleb held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. But then a voice rang out from the back. "I object." Caleb's heart sank. He turned and saw Jed standing there, his face contorted with anger. He had returned. "This wedding cannot proceed," Jed shouted, his voice echoing through the town square. "Sarah is promised to me. She belongs to me." The crowd gasped, their faces filled with fear. Caleb tightened his grip on Sarah's hand, his eyes blazing with anger. He wouldn't let Jed ruin their wedding. But then, something unexpected happened. The townspeople surged forward, surrounding Jed and his remaining men. They were armed with rifles, shotguns, and pitchforks. They were ready to defend Caleb and Sarah's love. "You're not welcome here, Jedediah," Hank roared, his voice booming across the town square. "Get out of our town, and don't ever come back." Jed looked around, his face filled with disbelief. He was outnumbered and outgunned. He knew he couldn't win. He cursed under his breath and turned to leave, his face contorted with hatred. "This isn't over, Caleb," he snarled. "I'll be back." But Caleb knew that he wouldn't. He had the townspeople on his side, and they wouldn't let Jed harm him or Sarah. They had driven Jed and his gang out of town, and they would never let them return. Caleb's mother would have been proud. They could finally be happy. With Jed gone for good, the wedding proceeded, filled with joy and laughter. Caleb and Sarah exchanged their vows, their voices ringing with sincerity. They placed the silver bands on each other's fingers, sealing their commitment. The townspeople cheered, their faces beaming with happiness. They had witnessed a love story unfold before their very eyes, a love story that had overcome hardship and danger. They knew that Caleb and Sarah were destined to be together. After the ceremony, the townspeople gathered in the town square for a wedding feast. They ate, drank, and danced, celebrating the union of Caleb and Sarah. The air was filled with music and laughter, a testament to the power of love and community. As the sun began to set, Caleb and Sarah bid farewell to their friends and neighbors. They mounted Dusty and rode towards the ranch, their hearts filled with happiness. As they rode, they looked out at the land, their land. They saw the rolling hills, the towering mountains, and the endless plains. They knew that they were home. They reached the ranch house and dismounted, their hands intertwined. They walked inside, their footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. The house was different now. It was no longer filled with silence and loneliness. It was filled with love and laughter. It was filled with hope and promise. Caleb and Sarah spent the rest of their lives on the ranch, building a life together. They worked hard, tending to the cattle, mending the fences, and planting the crops. They faced challenges and hardships, but they always overcame them, their love growing stronger with each passing day. They had children, sons and daughters who filled the house with joy. They taught them about the land, about the importance of family, and about the power of love. Caleb never forgot his mother's last prayer. He knew that Sarah was the answer to that prayer, the woman he was meant to spend his life with. He was grateful for her love, her courage, and her unwavering spirit. And Sarah never forgot the night she had slept in Caleb's hayloft. She knew that it was fate that had brought them together, that their love was meant to be. She was grateful for his kindness, his strength, and his unwavering loyalty. Together, they built a life filled with love, happiness, and purpose. They lived a long and fulfilling life, surrounded by their family and friends. And when they finally passed away, they were buried side by side, their love